Yeah, I think it's safe to say that, first of all, thank you for being here. This is the faithful remnant at this point, right? Yeah. Everybody's got life to get back to. I think I'm part of that group that went to seminary at one point to fix the church. Turns out that might not have been the reason to go to seminary. If that was, I was convinced, I think, that, one of the reasons why young people were not in church was that the church was broken. And if we could just fix it, they will come, And if that is the case, then my whole career in youth ministry has been an abject failure, because not only are young people's, they are less involved in churches, their faith is more tattered than it was, but I've come to realize that it was a theological misstep to think about, the church as the problem and young people as the solution, right? And so we're still in the process of repenting of that a little bit. The idea that the body of Christ is always broken because humans are part of it, but that's not the problem. And young people were never intended to solve our problems anyway. They are called in their own right to be part of the body of Christ. So anyway, it's with that framing comment, let me just jump in here, tell you a story about this guy. His name is Emile Leray, 1993. He's a French electrician. He decides in 1993, and it's important that it was before cell phones, that he's going to drive this little Citroen across the Moroccan desert. And there he gets to a checkpoint, and they tell him, "I'm sorry, sir, you can't go any further than this because there's no water, there's no place, to resource you if you get into trouble out further. The roads are bad." And so he does what a lot of people would do when told no. He ignores them. He finds another way around it, and he decides to cross the desert at this point anyway, because it was a shorter route to where he was going. Well, predictably, he gets, he gets a good ways in, quite a ways away from any checkpoints, and he breaks his axle. He hits a rock. And this little car is done at this point. So now he has a dilemma, right? He is too far from a place. He has a little bit of water, but not a lot. It's too far from the nearest village really to walk without taking the desert taking its toll on you first. He has a toolkit with him, but he can't fix the axle. That's broken. So now he's in a spot. What are some of the options he has? Just throw some things out. Have you seen my slides ahead of this? Yes. So, okay, well, I'll skip all of the drama then, and we'll go to what happened. Micah? Yeah, I got to make sure you're in every group I'm with. Yeah. And so anyway, so what he does, he dismantles the car, he rebuilds it into this, and he drives it successfully into the next town. What happened here? Okay. Okay, good. I'm so happy. Oh, well, unfortunately, I didn't bring... Oh, yeah, I do have a power cord. You want the power cord? The problem is not in your set. Hold, please. Okay, so anyway, he drives it into the next town, but wait, there's more. The first thing that happens when he gets in the next town, can you guess? It does not break. There's no, all of those things were okay. What happens is he got a ticket. Because the license he had on this thing was from this car, and this is not a car. Which just goes to show that no good deed goes unpunished in the world of innovation. When you try something different, no matter how well it seems to solve the problem, it is really hard to make that okay with people, at least at first, right? So one of the things that we like to do, a friend and I often show these slides when we're working with churches in training, and we have people go, what would your church do if you were stuck in the middle of nowhere and had to, had all of these limited resources? And they say things like build a committee, all these sorts of things. And even when churches are able to get the new thing going, the ability to actually make it function in the world that they have to function in is its own set of problems. I want to show you a TikTok clip that a student of mine sent me this while I was here. And it was so on point that I felt like I needed to show it to you. And I'm going to let it speak for itself, and then we'll talk about it in a minute, okay?
It just feels like when Google Maps takes you to a Starbucks that's inside of a Target. It's not cool. Nobody wants that.
Okay, so just take a second with the person that you're close to there and just play around with that. Is she right? Are these new forms of Christian community, these new ways of being with people, are we just trying to sneak Jesus into their lives? Is there something to her critique that we should take into account? Take a second and then we'll talk. All right, I'm going to bring us into one conversation because I'm curious about what's happening out here. So what do you think? What's come up in your groups? Valid point? Something that would that you want to nuance in any way? Stephanie, you had your thumbs up. Why is it a valid point?
I loved it. I thought that's great, why not? I thought, some of my best conversations about theology have happened over a glass of whiskey, and I think it's a great way, right?
Okay, all right. Go ahead.
My first thought was that this isn't actually all that new because Monk's been brewing beer for a long time.
That's true. Well said. Yes.
Also, I think it depends on what your approach is. Like, are you a church that brews beer as a cover, or are you actually
Right. Yeah. That. Well said. Go ahead, Jasmine.
So the guy didn't actually market it as a brewery first. He said it was cool, and maybe she's not looking for cool. Maybe she's looking for that spiritual whatever, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
Yeah. It is interesting that there is some data that suggests that young people want a church to look, feel, smell like a church, and they are. I don't know that there has been comparison on who's going where. Excuse me while I turn my phone off. The wheels are off for sure. Good grief. Oh, good. Yeah, go ahead.
Stephanie and I are on the same page of lumber, but decades apart in age. But where are the young people? They're in the barn.
Uh-huh. That's one place they are, yeah. Yeah.
Is it discipleship or is it drum times? Like, are we going to be just like, what's the second service?
Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah. Good question. We don't know yet. Go ahead. Keith, and then I saw a hand back here. Yeah, sorry.
I know we've done a lot of piggybacking on each other in different lectures, but you have to ask yourself, someone asked, where are the young people? You have to ask yourself, and if they're in the bars, ask yourself, why are they in the bars? Are they in the bars to have a good time with each other and build community? Are they in a bar to wash away their sorrows, for lack of a better way of putting it? Are they are they there to unwind, or young people will go to a bar for very different reasons for why they would go to a church.
Yeah.
There might be a deeper reason as to why they would consider church. And if they're going to a bar looking for something that they know that they can't achieve in a bar, then conversation ensues. Here, open up the door for this conversation.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways that a brewery might be a ministry. It doesn't always have to be positioning itself as a church. Some do. Yeah, go ahead.
I always appreciate this type of humor because there's always some element of truth in humor. And, a laugh came out in the room and in
Yeah.
your audience. And, that speaks to the fact that all of us, even as Christians here, have been made to feel uncomfortable by other Christians in their evangelism. And,
Yeah.
that is a real thing, especially for our nuns that you've talked about,
Yeah.
where, they don't necessarily want to be approached. And so, to me, it speaks to that kind of heart of how we're connecting with people. And what is it, if we're marketing to everybody, we're not marketing to anyone.
Yeah.
If it's, right? And so
Yeah.
it's kind of what is your purpose in being there and in line with discipleship? How are you cultivating relationship? And, so she kind of just really in a pointed way makes that point. And I think in many ways she's right.
Okay, two more comments, and then go ahead, and then
So you made,
Three.
sorry.
we're going to do three more comments. I saw three.
Okay.
Okay.
You made the comment in the last, it was one of the lectures where you said, don't build your own Christian version of something, but just kind of, and you used the example of, Christian music, which is hit or miss. And so when I think about, someone describing church as cool, I'm always like, is it really, though? Because I feel like a lot of Christian attempts to be cool are actually really cringy.
Yeah. Which she might have hinted at there. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
We all know that this is just the story has been spun a little bit to make it human.
Right.
But if we take it at surface level, the issue isn't that, the problem is that he was selling church and not presenting Jesus.
Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah.
Right, it's, wherever Jesus is, that's what we all need, including our friends,
Yeah.
not church is cool.
Right. Go ahead.
I was a bartender on this campus when I did my undergrad, before I came to know Jesus, and I can tell you that all the people that I served weren't in there trying to find Jesus while they were in there. They were trying to find Jesus when they were leaving there.
Yeah. Well said. So, go ahead.
In the church calendar, we have Christmas and Easter, and so we've been taking things from the pagans for a long time.
Yeah. Good point. Listen, her name is Emily Catalano. She was raised evangelical in Texas, which is its own special brand of evangelical, let me tell you. And she talks about it a lot in some of her acts, but I just want you to pay attention to the kind of conversation we have just had, right? It's a pretty generative way of thinking about who we are as a church. There's no reason why that conversation can't happen in your congregation too, right? And so for us to be able to, Augustine talks about pilfering the Egyptians. So we are definitely pilfering the Egyptians when we go to comedy sketches on TikTok. But, it's sometimes it becomes the bridge. And whether we are doing church well or not is a matter of what, this is the discussion. It's not that they are or aren't doing church well. That's not the point. The point is what we come up with as what is the faithful way to represent this congregation, you know, in a way that doesn't feel like you're pulling something over on somebody, right? So anyway, just for food for thought, we're going to talk about forming a sacred imagination here. And what I want to suggest is that when we talk about forming faith identities, we think about what we want young people to know, right? We want them, and sometimes we talk about knowing Jesus. And that's a tricky phrase, because knowing Jesus means knowing who Jesus is and all the things that we know about Jesus from Scripture. And then there's the relational knowing, the trust knowing. And a lot of times I wish we could get weaned off of the phrase believe and talk in terms of trust. Not so much what do you believe? That feels like a neck up project to me, versus what do you trust, you know, and where do you place your trust? Forming a sacred imagination suggests that the project of formation is not simply a cognitive piece. There's cognitive parts to it, but the imagination is what allows you to think about what the kingdom of God is like that is at hand, what the kingdom of God is like in this particular community. You've got to be able to imagine something that isn't there currently, right? And so how do you do that? This is one of the things, we're learning some of this from existentialist educators. Maxine Green, who taught at New York University for a gazillion years, is the most famous one in the United States on this. And her point is that all of education is really about forming an imagination. And this is an approach to formation. It's not like a formula for how to do formation, but thinking about what the end goal is. And what you're trying to do is to create a way of thinking that allows people to imagine the world as if it were otherwise, right? And you probably know of a theologian who has talked about this with different terms. You know Walter Brueggemann? He just died last week. Yeah. And he talks about the prophetic imagination, which is the same, and the idea of forming a prophetic imagination in Christians simply means our ability to imagine the world as if it were different from the point of view of Jesus, right? From God's side of the clock. So trying to figure out, what does the world look like? How can we imagine it in a way that is faithful to what God had in mind? And Brueggemann outlines 3 moves, really, in forming a prophetic imagination. And the first thing he says that you've got to do if you are a prophet and you are imagining the new reality, you don't just start with saying, hey, here's a picture of what we could do differently. First, you have to acknowledge the reality that you're in. You can't change things if you don't know something is broken or something is wrong or something needs to be adapted or shifted. So the first thing is name the reality. And then anytime change is involved, there's going to be a loss. So you've got to take a minute to grieve what is being lost. This is a step that I think people who are interested in innovating church often skip. And we do that at our peril. Most of us learn to build it in because we have forgotten it at one point and we paid for that, right? But you've got people that are very much wed to the way things are for whatever reason. The building was built by their ancestors, right? Or they remember a pastor from years gone by who was dear to them for whatever reason, and to move the pulpit around would somehow, they're not conscious about this necessarily, but it somehow feels like it cheapens the memory, right? So you got to have a little bit of time to grieve. What is it that's changing? And what is being lost in that? So that we're not just kind of catapulting into the new reality. And it's only after those 2 steps, says Brueggemann, that you want to describe the new reality, the hope that you have, the new reality that Jesus promises. And that is when the sacred imagination kicks into its, constructive work. This is what it could look like if. Imagine the world as if there was something different. So I'm going to give you the results of a report from the Fetzer Institute, which gathered a bunch of church leaders together in 2022 to kind of create some guiding principles for what it would be like to imagine the church going forward. And these guiding principles may or may not be the ones you want to use, but let's use it as a place to play with, and it might spur some other ideas for you. So anyway, this is what the report looks like. And principle 1, yes space nurtures both souls and ideas. So the questions that leads to include things like, how is the Holy Spirit going to manifest in yes spaces? What does the Holy Spirit look like when you're in a space that says yes? And do young adults experience your church as a yes space or a no space? If yes space are what nurture their souls and their ideas, if your church is a no space, that's going to be a non-starter there. Okay? Principle number 2. It's okay to start small and stay small. In fact, sometimes this may be the most faithful option. So what does it mean if we're going to focus on 1 or 2 domains in our ministry? How does just having that focus clarify where the Spirit might be moving for us? Instead of trying to be all things to all people. How can we use thriving rather than growth as the primary metric for ministry? And if we do that, how can we do that in a way that lets us still stay afloat? A lot of our metrics are based on the financial model that we have, that the number of people involved equals the number of dollars that we receive. So how's that going to work? Principle number 3. Revivals need tents, not buildings. So really what they're trying to do is to move us away from temples and back towards tabernacles, right? To think in terms of, what happens if we stop idolizing permanence? And how do we cultivate instances of church instead of religious organizations? What does that look like? These are different frameworks to think through. I'm going to give you a summary of this, and if you guys want these slides, I think John will have them before. Principle number 4. If we're going to create something new, it depends on relationships outside our own faith communities. Now, what's undergirding this is the assumption that the folks who were consulting on this believe that there is no one Christian tradition that has the gifts to address all of the world's problems, right? We need each other. I always think that, religion is the blind man and the elephant story. We all think we've got the answer to what the elephant is, depending upon the part of the beast we're holding on to. And what that story says to me is we need each other. Your tradition's going to see parts of the elephant that my tradition doesn't see. None of us have the whole picture. But of course, it's true even if it's not with a partnership with another Christian community. It might be a partnership with other nonprofits in your area. It might be your connection to a school. Somebody was talking about that yesterday. There are lots of ways to be connected. The point is we can't look at the church as an individual entity as being the solution to the problem. None of us have that many resources. So what does it look like if the church is curious, right? Instead of thinks it has the answers. We'll come back to that. Finally, principle number 5, the wilderness is not the enemy. I'm in Canada. You all don't, none of you think the wilderness is the enemy. Aren't you all wilderness people? That's the impression that we all have, right? Yeah, we know Dale is, yeah. So at what cost are we making people comfortable or making ourselves comfortable? Where's the edge? How do we know if we're getting close to it? And what would we do with our ministry if we weren't afraid? Okay, those are the guiding principles as we move forward into faith communities and ministry expressions that are imagining the world as if. All right, this is the summary list. I'm going to come back to that, but just so you see the questions. You're going to turn to your partner for a second. Which principle do you like? Which one scares you? Okay, there's the list. Okay, take a second and go, just play around with that. Got about 3 minutes. One more minute. All right, let's come back together. I want you to remember this, remember the conversation. We're going to come back to it in just a second. We're just going to add one more piece to it, okay? This is a monkey, this is a coconut. This will make sense in a second, okay? So, there is no motorcycle that is going to be invented from that coconut. But this is just an excuse to include random things I've learned recently into these things. So apparently in southern India, when monkeys become a problem for farmers, they, and Micah, you already know how this ends, don't you? I'm sure you do, yeah. He already knows all the punchlines. Anyway, they, to get rid of these monkeys, traps are really, they hurt the monkeys. So farmers don't want to use traps, but they keep stealing all the food, so they got to get rid of them somehow, but that's what they think. So the traditional way of getting rid of a monkey is apparently you make a hole in a coconut. He does know the end of this. I'm watching him nod. This is hilarious. I just learned this week. You know everything already. And anyway, so you put a hole in the coconut, and then you stick a banana inside the coconut, okay? And the monkey does what? Puts his hand in the coconut, and because monkeys are greedy, they grab the banana, and then they won't let go, right? And you get this happening, which is kind of sad, but it will illustrate the point. Okay, you get the idea. I don't want to put this poor monkey through more than he needs to. Okay, the point is that the monkey's entrapment is self-inflicted. All he has to do is let go of the banana and his hand will come out of there. So the question is, if you have some of these guidelines in your mind about where your church could go, what's stopping you, right? What's your banana? What's your church's banana? And maybe what's yours? What are you holding on to so tightly that you don't want to let go of? We talked about detachment yesterday. This is a form of it, right? What's stopping you from implementing some of these guiding principles about sacred imagination in church? Go. One more minute. All right, we're going to come back together again. And we have spent a lot of this week exploring lots of different examples of ways people are trying to be with people in different ways. We've talked about a lot of those little boats that are in people's garages. Some of them are really ready to go, and some of them are just really kind of flaky. But they're all out there as part of the flotilla that God is calling into service. I'm going to offer one final kind of image that might help guide you as you're thinking about these new ways of being with people. Because they actually, even if the ministry itself winds up being a flop, they actually serve another purpose as we move faith into the second part of this second quarter of this century. There's a term, refugia, I think it's called. I probably will say it that 3 different ways before the end of today, which it comes from ecology and conservationists. And a refugia this is the technical definition. It's a small isolated area where plants and animals find refuge from unfavorable conditions. All right. And the book that I am using as kind of the framework for this is Deborah Reinstra. If you're looking for a book that'll change your life, this is a good one. Refugia Faith. And she frames her argument with the story of Mount St. Helens, which erupted, some of you might remember this, in 1980. And it was a massive ecological disaster for that area, in part because it literally blew a third of the mountain off the top. Ash shot 15 miles into the air, and it blew the top off that mountain, and the summit got 1,300 feet shorter as a result of this. The temperature apparently reached like 600 degrees. Of course, it melted the snow and the glaciers and all of that. It sent, I guess, 7 billion, it says, gallons of water down the mountain. And that mixed with the molten ash, right? And so it created these huge mud flows and and they came so fast They were traveling at like 300 miles an hour down that mountain, that mud flow was. And so it dismantled rocks. It created the largest landslide in recorded history through that. The landslide went 15 miles forward of the mountain. It carried sediment about 75 miles away into other rivers. 57 people died during this. And the devastation to the habitat was seemed really unthinkable. It was a shipwreck of ecological proportions. And the thing that they thought would hold gave way, right? Okay, this is what it looked like the day after the explosion. And President Jimmy Carter flew over to survey the damage, and there were no trees, there was no life, there were no plants, of course, there was almost no land that they could see. It was just ash and smoke. And he said, he was quoted as saying, "There is no way to prepare ourselves for the sight we beheld this morning." Now, after that eruption, scientists predicted it would take a generation for that ecological habitat to regenerate. It might take more. They weren't sure. But 2 weeks later, a team of ecologists went and stepped into the damage, and one of them noticed a 2-inch sprout. It was fireweed that was poking through the ash. And then, a year later, the elk returned. 200 elk returned to this land. It still looks pretty barren, right? But also, other wildlife came too, frogs, toads, and so on. And then in 2019, right, so quite a bit later, it looks like this. And 3 years later, it wasn't an old growth forest, but it looked pretty good. And 3 years later, it looked like this. So our faith is filled with stories of refugias, right? Noah had an ark, a little safe space to protect people from destruction. Moses had a basket to escape Pharaoh's decrees. The Holy Family had Egypt to escape the murder of the innocents. So one way to think about all those little boats that are in your garage that you are working hard at trying to get people involved in being with each other in new ways are to think of them as refugias. These are places. So in nature, what happens, a refugia might be like the cracks in the bark of a tree, right? Where little spores get inside the crack, little seeds that they get stuck there. And because some of that bark is heat resistant, it doesn't get destroyed in the forest fire. Or it'll be like a little crevice in a rock, and there'll be some seeds and some soil and some spores that fall into that rock, right? And because the mud flow is going so fast over top, it doesn't seep in. And they're protected. This is how they explain the regrowth of forests after the forest fire. And this is what happened after Mount St. Helens erupted too. And the refugias aren't intended to be permanent. It's not, you can't grow to your maximum height as a plant, in the crevice of a rock. There's not enough dirt down there to do it. But what you can do is get a head start. You can put down some roots so they can develop. You kind of strengthen, you toughen up a little bit as a seedling. And so what that means is as it grows and as the wind maybe blows the larger plant out of its resting place, it has the equipment to take root someplace else. Make sense? This is what's going on in these little boats. You are creating these refugias. They may or may not be the church of the future. They may or may not be the church of next week, right? But they are places where you are providing that will give young people a protected space in an inhospitable environment for their faith. And so one way to think about what you're doing is by giving them this little temporary refuge to allow them to strengthen their roots until they can be transplanted into some other more long-lasting place. And it's because of these refugias that after shipwreck, faith doesn't sink. They find places that they can survive. They've been protected for just long enough. We talked a little bit about ways of these different ways of being with young adults. And I want to think about some of the specific things that are happening in these refugias, specific ways in which we are learning to be with young adults while they're in these protected spaces. And we're going to talk about them in terms of solidarity, support, and sacrificial love, okay? I'm calling these the art of neighboring, the art of accompaniment, and the art of self-giving, right? So let me just jump into this. If you got questions, just stop me here. Okay, first, solidarity. One way that we are with young people in these refugias is by trying to be with them, right? And one of the skills that we need to reclaim in order for that to work, we've talked about this 100 times this week, is curiosity. So here's the scene that'll set it up. For you, those of you who haven't seen Ted Lasso, it's a story of an American football coach who winds up in the UK coaching a soccer team. Doesn't know a darn thing about soccer, but he's got a lot of EQ, right? So he's really good at the human dynamic side of things. And he is underestimated by everyone. His team, his team is terrible, but they're getting better. And so anyway, they're in a bar, and the owner of another team basically makes a bet with him that whoever wins the dart game will stay out of the way of the other one. That's the setup, okay? So enjoy.
Mate, what do I need to win?
2 triple 20s and a bullseye.
Good luck. You know, Rupert, guys have underestimated me my entire life. And for years, I never understood why. It used to really bother me. But then one day, I was driving my little boy to school, and I saw this quote by Walt Whitman. It was painted on the wall there. It said, "Be curious, not judgmental." I like that. So I get back in my car, and I'm driving to work, and all of a sudden, it hits me. All them fellas that used to belittle me, not a single one of them were curious. You know, they thought they had everything all figured out, and so they judged everything, and they judged everyone. And I realized that they're underestimating me. Who I was had nothing to do with it. Because if they were curious, they would ask questions, you know? Questions like, have you played a lot of darts, Ted? Which I would have answered, yes, sir. Every Sunday afternoon at a sports bar with my father from age 10 until I was 16 when he passed away. Barbecue sauce.
So what we're doing with young people when we are in solidarity with them is we're trying to be curious with them. And so that means a couple of things. First of all, it means we got to repent of reaching people, okay? I mean, nobody wants to be reached, right? It's like, that's creepy. Yeah, we can agree, that's creepy. What young adults do want to be is befriended, neighbored, right? What are some ways that we neighbor one another, right? So the first thing it takes, as the Ted Lasso clip shows us, is we've got to cultivate some humility, right? We don't have it all figured out. We don't have them all figured out. So that's the first step for curiosity, is humility. The second thing is we tell stories. You know, that's what you do if you're trying to get to know somebody. And you tell a story, they tell a story. It's not a matter of grilling them with questions. It's a matter of sharing just the stories of your lives. So there's a lot of coffee dates that happen at this stage, you know, in the conversation. And the big task, I think, of this stage is learning what this young adult loves. We talk about trying to get to know young people, but I found it a lot easier to, instead of saying, tell me about you, to say, tell me what you love. It changes the conversation quite a bit, just to have that little nuance to it. And you learn a lot about what makes them tick, of course, but they get to talk out of the things that, you know, fill their souls most. which makes for a much easier conversation. We had a conversation yesterday somewhere about how hard it is for people to be mentors. And I think part of the reason for that is mentors tend to think that they have to answer questions, right? Instead of sharing stories and finding out what one another loves. The second thing that happens in refugias is support, right? And this is not just being with a young person, but it's being for the young person. So this is the art of accompaniment. So we're championing them in certain ways, right? And so the art of accompaniment involves things like the ministry of noticing. I think many of us have this story in our backgrounds that there was someone in the congregation that we were part of, or someone in a ministry that we were part of, that just made it their job to notice us. It allowed us to feel seen. And for me, there was a guy who's an octogenarian. He could hardly walk, but he made it his business to know, what my extracurricular activities were. He wouldn't ask, how are you doing, in a vague way. He would say, how's the play going that you're part of? Tell me about the part you're playing. He could get more specific because he was paying attention. He was just noticing. And that is a ministry. That is a great part of youth ministry. And the people who do that don't even know they're in ministry when they do that. But for them to understand how powerful those questions are, and that just the time to make it specific, is a really powerful way to affirm people. The art of accompaniment might be where we share a task with them. There's something they might need help with, or we just go over and mow the lawn once so they don't have to. Or we if they're young parents, we take the kids for an afternoon so that they have some free time. They're little things like that. They're small things, but they're things that neighbors do for one another, right? And in this stage, the question is not so much what do you love, but what do you long for? What's your desire, right? And then the third one is, I don't know really what to call it. I make these up, right? So they don't have fancy names, but the sacrificial love part is the example of being all in for somebody. And most of us have a story of somebody in our past who, for whatever reason, we knew they would go to the mat for us. And that was the experience of having someone who loved us in the way Jesus loved us, right? Somebody who would go all the way with us. It doesn't mean that we are necessarily, laying down our lives for one another, but we are at least exceeding their expectations. And I'm here to tell you that young adults have very low expectations for the church. So it's actually not hard to exceed their expectations. Incidentally, this Burning Bush Brewery, it is not a church that's in a brewery, but here's what happened. A guy came to a training event. He was a Presbyterian pastor, young adult pastor. And he noticed that he was creating better community in this little homemade brewery he'd put in his basement than he was in his congregation. And he got it in his head that he could do a better job building community if he was a brewer instead of a pastor. So he found a training event. He came to Princeton. And here was the act of sacrificial love. There was a guy, a random older guy in his congregation who was retired, who said to Brent, hey, I'll go with you. I mean, he didn't help Brent. He didn't know anything about breweries either. He actually did have a financial background, which was helpful. But he agreed to essentially just walk this path along with him as long as it took. And in fact, they started this brewery in Chicago. They started it right before the pandemic. It made it through the pandemic. This is what it looks like now. There's no pretending it's a church. It's not. It's a refugia. It's a place where people who at all levels of questioning or whatever can come share a drink and conversation together. And the community building, they're creating Christian community by example rather than by name, right? So his wife is a pastor. She provides the formal stuff too. And at this place, I think what we're doing is we're providing opportunities for young adults, right? Ways that they can use their voice, ways that they can use their leadership, ways that they can be part of the responsibility bearing. They're load-bearing members of a community, right? They're not just recipients of that. And what we're doing is we're trying to counter disappointment with grace. There's lots of people who have disappointment stories about the church. And to receive a little grace from the church is a massively important healing part of that. And this is where we ask the question, what is your dream? You know, what do you imagine the world being differently as? So this is where it is, right? I'm very curious for you to have this conversation. What is your congregation good at of these three things? Which one is hard for them? And what's hard for you? Okay? Again, you got 3 or 4 minutes. Go.
And to some extent, being even all you don't necessarily enjoy those things, but they're not created for you. Things like new
Talking while you were gone, she was talking in the context of young people.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
1 more minute.
Well, yeah, but fair enough. I think they do something well. I don't think young people, especially well, but they've had to deal with big things. We do. 4 years worth of dementia. None. No youth, maybe 1 or 2. And now every Sunday morning, children's time during the service, they're 25th. Not because of a strategy to reach them or something, right? It's just, yeah. So there is some sense to that. And yeah, they do some. I mean, Kathy and others do some good things. You know, we were too fun. There are folks doing stuff. And that's the science days, we figure out school.
All right, we're going to come back together for the last time here. This is the last book for your book list here. Couple psychologists, Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy, put this book together about organizations that are resistant to change. Wonder who they had in mind. Actually, churches are not part of that, what they had in mind, but the word immunity is intentional because they talk about immunity actually as a positive thing. You know, your immune system is there to protect you. So there's a resistance to change that is built into each of us and that is built into organizations, and that is designed to protect each of us and the organizations we're part of, because willy-nilly change will descend into madness and chaos, right? So we are wired to resist it. So that's one reason why it's hard. Having said that, they talk about the role imagination plays, the ability to imagine something different, the world as if it is different, right? And Peter Block is quoted in there saying, to believe in abundance is a stretch of the imagination. You know, we have a gospel of abundance, but it's hard for us because we're wired to resist that kind of change of framework, right? And so they make the point, which I think is helpful for us, that it is not enough just to be aware of a problem for change to happen. right? It's not enough even to know all of the problems the problem creates, right? What you have to do is get underneath of that to the assumptions that that problem is based on that are wrong, that are false, right? And once you can address the underlying assumption, then you can loosen the bolts a little bit and change might begin to happen. So awareness doesn't produce change, but dismantling our false assumptions is where change begins. And so how do we, and that means we have to detach, right, from the things that we thought were true, and that's difficult. And so they offer a process, and the book goes into a lot of detail about this, about the way you do that. The first thing you do is you have to identify the driving assumption, and then you have to challenge it to say, is that, actually ask, test it, is it true or not? What happens if we test this to see if it's true? Is it true, for example, that our elderly population in the church are the ones that are resisting change? Let's test that. You know what you'll find out? It's not true, right? Your middle-aged people are probably the ones that are most resistant to change because they've got the most to lose at that point, right? And so what we're doing is you're beginning to loosen the bolts on that assumption. And then you test imaginative alternatives, right? There's no promise that we get that imagining the world differently, that we get a good idea the first time, right? But we don't know until we try some things out. What we can't do is just sit there and do nothing. You've got to keep this process of testing and retesting and refining as part of the whole innovation process. And as you can see, there is a certain kind of resonance between those steps and what Walter Brueggemann talks about as the phases of developing the prophetic imagination. Name the reality, grieve the loss, and describe the hope. So I'm going to treat this as our benediction together. I'm going to close with a video. Let me set up what it is. On Valentine's Day in 2018, in Haifa, Israel, a musician that I've never heard of invited together anybody who wanted to sing to come and be part of this experiment. Mike is nodding. He's already seen this video. It's amazing. I'm just giving you a hard time. And so what happened was they put out this call. They didn't know who all would be coming. They had an old warehouse that they had rented out for this. And 3,000 people came. All ages, mostly young adults, but you'll see everybody there. And they were Muslims, Arabs, and Jews. They were Muslims, Jews, Christians, Arabs, Israelis, all in the same place. This was obviously before the current tensions. And I think it is one of the most moving examples of prophetic witness I've seen, the prophetic imagination in action here. And they had no idea that they were casting a vision for the kingdom of God. But watch, and this will be our benediction. Nope, not that.
התחנה הבאה, חיפה מרכז השמונה.
Refugia. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so much, Kenda, for that very powerful word. And we have time now for questions and conversation. I know there may be some things you'd like to ask, so who's first? I'll ask a question.
It's been a very long week here.
The Brueggemann, and he talked about the needing space to grieve, or giving time and space to grieve. How would you do that in a congregation? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, the way that I think the big thing that grief does, giving space for grief, is it slows us down. Because you can't, grief is not speedy, right? And you don't want, but to give, it's really easy when you're trying to do a new thing to let's get to it, let's get it done, let's get the thing underway, right? And grief kind of stops us from making this, faster, more efficient form of innovation from being the kind of innovation that we do. We have to stop and go back and say, wait a second, this isn't just about us, right? And we have to give people time to process whatever it is they're processing. But in terms of the process itself, I think the biggest benefit it does is it's just going to slow us down. So to give time for it is what that looks like, I think. It just means we don't have, a schedule that says, okay, we're going to name this, here's the problem, we're going to name the reality, this is wrong. Here's the solution, we're going to implement it tomorrow, right? It just gives people time to go a little slower into it. There's probably other things that I'm not thinking of that go with that, but that's what comes to mind. Yeah.
Thank you. Others?
I love the conversation about grief because I'm curious about the way that you help a church grieve as it's going through change. Like, do you have examples that you could share of a church corporately moving through change and actually giving space for that grief?
I'm trying to think of a concrete example. I have more examples of people who paid for the fact that they skipped it. Yeah, there is an example. Andy Root talks about this. His wife, I don't know if a lot of youth pastors have read Andy Root's stuff, so he's a practical theologian. They attend his wife's small Presbyterian church, and he talks about this guy in the congregation who was just opposed to everything that Cara is his wife's name. That Cara wanted to do some new things. They had a new kind of a worship pattern I think they were trying to get started. And this guy was just a curmudgeon. He was just not going along with anything. And everybody knew he was grumpy. They just sort of had learned to make a little space for him, but nobody expected anything different from him. But he just made life difficult going forward, right? For whatever reason, Cara knew that she had to kind of give him a little time to get on board with things. Anyway, they wound up going through, she couldn't just implement whatever it was she was going to do. They created a process, I think it involved a retreat maybe, where people could come and I don't remember what the theme of the retreat was or anything, but anyway, this guy was there. And because there was more time, they were able to get underneath of what some of that was. And so he was particularly grumpy towards I think she might have been the choir director, somebody on the church staff who was very into the new way of being a church that they wanted to be. And this guy just went after her. And he did it during the retreat. So everybody's watching it. And so Cara had the smarts to take a beat and say, okay, let's talk about what just happened here. And it was at that point, because this woman, everybody loved this woman, we'll call her Judy, and nobody could believe that he went after her like that. Well, what happened was, in the space of that exchange, he paused and he said, well, the truth is, you know my wife died a few years ago. And Judy reminds me a lot of my wife. And, I can't look at her without thinking about that. Okay, well, that little piece of information changed the whole thing. Because now this guy was instead of just being the labeled guy as the grumpy, and he wasn't helping himself in any of this, right? But now they had this little window into him that made him a human being. And being human takes time. So it allowed them to approach him, to address some of the things that he was dealing with as a congregation. They surrounded him as a congregation, as you would. And I don't even know the specifics of what they did, but they basically just sort of held this change they were going to make in limbo while they cared for the person first. That takes time. And it can be frustrating because sometimes these people, that you care for, they don't appreciate it or whatever it is. It's like people are people. But when people are peopling, you got to take time to deal with it. So that's the example that comes to mind on that. And I'm sure that everybody here has an example sort of like that somewhere. Yeah.
This is a question from online. Under principle number 3, when we have so many buildings, how do you move to tents? Can you go tenting often while still having buildings, or could you even start tenting in the building?
Love that question, yeah. Well, I think the biggest conversation that churches are having practically right now, this is true in the U.S., I don't know about Canada, but I bet there's an analogy here, is on asset redeployment. And what that means is, how are we going to use our building? How are we going to use our property differently, right? The way we're using for most churches, it's underutilized currently, or it's not being utilized in a way that makes any sense in the community they're in anymore. And so for most congregations, the solution is what? Sell the building, right? Or if they would so that's the piece that you want people to think about. So you've got to think about, all right, so what happens if this building is not quite so immobile? And by that I mean, if we can think of different ways to use it, right? It kind of makes it a little more tent-like. There's a church in Arlington, Virginia. It's an old historic church. They got really literal with this. It was on a piece of prime real estate. And so one of these big stone Presbyterian churches. And they decided to tear down the church to build housing. They were emphasizing housing for autistic people. And the church meets in the bottom floor of this housing unit, but they turned their ministry into a housing ministry with a worshiping community that meets there. And so that was one way they went tenting. And they kind of went tenting in the building, but they mostly just tore down the building. I think, though, that the way we are thinking about property is going to be the frontier that we are in the middle of dealing with right now. I hear a lot more conversations about that than anything else. So it's just a matter of being a little more limber. A tent you can pack up different ways. So I take that tent to be metaphorical. But maybe they've got a real one. I don't know.
Or you could have a boat church in London.
There is a boat church in London, yes. That's how I know about it, yeah.
Thank you, Kenda. I really love the way you started today, and I'm sure you know how the idea of formation resonates with us as a faculty, as a school. But you jumped from formation to Bergerman, and then the third step of Bergerman that described hope. And it sounds, again, very cognitive to me. So I'm wondering, how... Okay, I guess I should put it this way. How can we make sure that this project of imagination will not become another neck-up thing?
Yeah, it could be, couldn't it? As soon as it becomes neck-up, it stops being quite so imaginative. But I do think that there's something to the spaces that we literally inhabit shape how we think, right? And so there is a lot, I believe, like in the classroom, I'm always trying to get out of the classroom to do things, because actually it's the logic of pilgrimage, right? If you are physically moving from one place to another, somehow your mind and imagination moves with you, right? And if you stay in one place, that's harder to do. So I do think that there is a learning strategy that goes with this, to your point, and it does mean that we've got to be less tied to some of our current structures. And I don't think we need to abandon all of our structures, but we do need to get out of them sometimes. And the ability to imagine the world differently, I mean, when you are encountering the other, right? Like not just thinking about them, encountering them, meeting them, talking to them, eating with them, you think about, you understand them better, of course, but you also think about them differently. They're not an abstraction, they're human. So there's a lot about, and youth ministry is pretty good at this, of trying to get people to encounter the other in a different way, kind of thing. But
thanks, Kenda. I have a question. When we talk about the point on helping churches grieve something and let go so we can, describe the hope, move on. Some of the points that you were making, it seems to me, and I think of even your 5 principles about the imagination, okay to start small, stay small, the wilderness is not the enemy, maybe co-creating depending on others, not just our agency, that for evangelicals, often more than simply we're tied to a practice or a building, that there's something more fundamental about our identity and our character. And I think of the historian David Bebbington, who talked about kind of 4 classic features of evangelical identity, which he was looking at Britain from late 1700s on through the last century. But it seems to resonate with evangelicals in North America as well. And one of those is the activism piece. So when we talk about not trying to reach because that's a little bit creepy, right? Or wanting church to be cool because you're constantly trying to get there, or some of that stuff is so deeply ingrained, not just in a practice, but in evangelicals' sense of identity and who we are, that I wonder how you navigate that when it's not external to you, but it's actually something you've internalized so deeply.
Well, it's a great question. And, I'm unapologetically a Methodist. We're a form of evangelical, we think we are. Some other people don't. But because that is looser in my own DNA, it's a little hard for me to imagine it. But I can say that if there's a theme to this, the only way I know how to dislodge some of our preconceptions is to encounter the human being on the other side. If we can make relationships with people who rather than just treat them as somebody that we bring an agenda to, it changes the way we kind of organically respond to them differently. You don't think about your friends as people you have to go reach. You think about reaching people you don't already know, right? And so, and I'm using that as kind of a straw man to make the point, but I guess it's a plea. Let's get out of our bubbles and, rub shoulders with people who aren't like us and try to figure out what it means to be human together, as opposed to treating them as a group and us as a group, and somehow we have to create the bridge there. I think there's a lot of the bridge that happens in the sinews of a relationship that will stop us from feeling like we have to create it all the time. And that is not a very satisfying answer if that's part of your evangelical DNA. So.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. In one of the slides you asked the question, which one of those 5 things you like, which one of those 5 things you don't like.
Right.
Now, in one of those, you mentioned that things that start small may remain small. In most of our psyche,
Right.
when we start something, grow something, we want it to grow. We
Right.
don't want a seed to stay a seed.
Right.
Even though it's kind of still alive.
Right. Right.
First of all, can you clarify that?
Okay.
If whatever we want to grow is still small and forever small, how can we counter? If it is true, how can we counter this psyche?
Right. Well, so I take that to be, this is my interpretation of what their statement is, that there are multiple ways to grow. You know, some are visible growth in terms of size, and that's the kind that we all tend to privilege. But, you know, I don't have a lot of biological know-how to come up with something off the top of my head, but you know how there are, it's like lavender, I think, takes 3 years before it grows because it's building the root system underground, right? And it's not that there isn't an external version of that, but the root system is really where it's at if you're lavender. Apparently redwoods are similar to that. You know, the root system underneath is what holds them up. Yeah, they're huge trees, but what's happening underground is even more significant. So I think it's a matter of growing deep as opposed to just always growing wide that matters. I would take that to mean, you know, if I have a small, and I do, as you know, I have a small church community, and to let's be honest, we want that church to grow if we can. But in the absence of the resources and a lot of the other structures that make that very easy, to focus on the growth of the people who are there in terms of their own spiritual depth, you know, that has the effect, I think, of actually, I guess you could say that does kind of grow things, because as the deeper you go in your own faith, the more comfortable you become sharing that with other people. But it may not be in that little church community. It may be in some other way. So I take that to mean that there are multiple kinds of growth, and we need to just pay attention to all of them rather than the kind that are visibly numbers and, you know, buildings kind of thing. So.
I've been reflecting a lot on Ignatian sort of thought and contemplative prayer, imaginative prayer, and how that sort of has translated through the Jesuits into a lot of really, in a lot of domains or spheres of life, in a practical ministry that's transformative. Just any thought about sort of that connection, or I don't know if you're familiar with some of that at all. It's not something I know a lot about either, but.
Well, I think that's, imaginative prayer is definitely a practice that I think has some traction right now. You know, that's the kind of prayer where you kind of put yourself into the position of, you know, of Scripture, for example, and you imagine what it's like to be, what does it smell like to be on the boat with Jesus, kind of thing. My hunch is, this is a hunch, I don't know this for sure, but my hunch is that is a prayer practice that would be very fruitful for people who are interested in imagining, you know, who have a different way of thinking about the church than we do, you know, and because it allows them to bring some of their own stuff into it. I'm a fan of lots of different kinds of prayer practices and to introducing people to lots of them, because I think personality, context, background, they all kind of factor into which ones are helpful for you. It's not that one works and one doesn't. It's that they all, quote unquote, work, but they are, we have a lot of them because there have been a lot of people praying over the years, you know. So good luck with that. We need you, yeah.
So a lot of the things that we've talked about, it's been pretty exciting and encouraging to know that they don't have to be forever, right? It works for this season, and then it's done, and then we try something new. But one of the things that I was thinking about is, as someone who's been in youth ministry for a while, what are some of the ways that you've made your career sustainable while you have these different seasons of different activities and how things are moving?
Well, first of all, that assumes I've made it sustainable. I'm not sure that's actually, that might not be the reality, but I don't know. I'd be curious to know how other people who have been in ministry for a while would answer this, because my experience has been that life hands you chapters. You don't have to go looking for them, right? And there are some chapters where some forms of prayer. So I was in the first time I flunked spiritual direction, my spiritual director was a priest. He was a Dominican priest. And I had an 8-month-old baby at home. And, I was trying to finish school and a lot of other things were going on. And what he wanted me to do was to pray pray the hours, essentially, pray at certain times a day. And I'm like looking at my life going, that is just never going to happen, So I had to learn that, okay, at this season in my life, I'm going to have to find something different, And there are another way that showed up for me anyway is, there was a point at which I had to withdraw from doing, in-person youth ministry on the ground, because I had kids at home of my own who, I do believe your children are your most important youth ministry. But in that chapter, I had to be a witness to them in a different way than as their youth leader, the kids as their youth leader, right? And there are thousands of examples of that. So I don't know that the season thing it's not like I go into these seasons going, how am I going to sustain this? It's more like, how am I going to live through this until the next one? And there are way better people at this than I am. Sustainability might not be one of my strong points. But what I did learn was when it felt unsustainable to go get help. Find the spiritual director, find a colleague, who could travel that a little bit with me. Because when it felt unsustainable, it wasn't like there was a strategy. It was more like, I'm drowning. I need a life raft, Forget the sustainability. Just get me out of the water. And so that meant I needed to go find somebody. And I'm a big fan of not doing ministry alone. So, yeah.
Any final questions?
A number of years ago, I had a man come into the office. We were going through a season of change. He was a great guy, almost always had a smile on his face. Older gentleman sat down and, with some discouragement, asked the question about the changes we were going through. Did we ever do anything right? And it caused me to realize that he had sacrificed family vacations to pay for some of the ministry experiments, that his parents had skipped meals to build the church. These kind of things, that as much as we sacrifice now, at least that much they sacrificed before. So as we think about the boats of Dunkirk and how we need new ones today, can you, in your experience, draw on ways to help honor and bring closure to the other boats that aren't going to be used anymore?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. I think that one thing that is helpful is to recognize, well, first of all, just to recognize that there has been a lot of, we stand on the shoulders of others, right? There's been a lot of sacrifice that's gotten us to the point where we can think about experimenting now, And just naming that and acknowledging that goes a long way. Because you don't want folks to feel left behind in that, and you don't want them to feel devalued, because we couldn't be where we are now without it. I don't know that there's I don't have a silver bullet for this, but the fact that you were there pastorally for him at that moment strikes me as such a gift for both him and for the church being able to move forward, right? And that he felt the kind of trust in you that he could come to you with that concern. But I think he speaks for a lot of people who aren't really, and often they're not in the conversations about innovation, right? And they get surprised by it somehow. And so for them not to be in the conversation, to get surprised by it, it's like, wait a second, we're going to tear down what my parents paid for those windows, kind of thing, And so I'm a big fan of ritual for if you're doing a physical change of some kind in particular, where there's going to be something that is going to look different, right? To somehow ritualize the transition, you know. And I don't know that there's that's not rocket science, but it at least it does a few things, right? It acknowledges, it names, it lifts up, right? And it also creates a pathway to move forward a little bit, you know, because there's a thing you can point to. The other thing, though, that in your story, it strikes me as, you know, might be things that we have overlooked that we want to keep, you know, that we didn't know were there. And so I actually think that maybe our biggest risk when we're doing this sort of thing is just not getting enough feedback in the initial conversations. If we don't know that this is something that is important to somebody, that's kind of on us, right? And for them to be part of imagining, they too can be part of the imagination thing. And for them to be part of that allows them to kind of bring in what they want to keep in that as you move forward. I think typically we either don't know, don't take the time to find out, you know, what treasures we might be trampling on. And it's kind of, I guess the analogy is like when they are excavating and they find out that they're excavating. You have to stop the excavation when you discover the relics and figure out what you're going to do with them, because you're not going to destroy them. And although not all of them can be saved, right? You've got to figure out a way to honor them in a way that makes sense for the dignity of the people for whom they were important, and also that allows you to ultimately build the highway, you know? The highway doesn't stop forever, but it might stop for a little time, or it might get rerouted a little bit. So it's a beautiful story, though. Thanks.
Thank you for all of your questions, and join me again in thanking Dr. Creasy Dean.